It was a mild Saturday afternoon in early September, the kind that made one grateful for well-oiled hinges on garden gates and the gentle creak of wicker chairs beneath a blanket of sunshine. In the village of Farnscombe Parva, just down the road from St. Mary Mead, but never quite as clever, as Miss Marple once remarked, the annual harvest fete was underway. Set in the expansive grounds of the late Colonel Abernathy's estate, now occupied by his widow, the fete was a charming affair of jam stalls, homegrown marrows, charity raffles, and politely competitive Victoria sponge judging. Children darted between the bunting, trailing streamers, while the vicar's wife presided over the tea tent with a mixture of benevolent tyranny and trembling silver tongs. Miss Marple sat beneath a canvas awning beside a table laden with crochet doilies, her lap a careful nest of knitting. Though invited as a guest, she had managed, without appearing to gather an enviable quantity of local knowledge in the space of an hour. It was, as she had often observed, astonishing what people revealed when offered a slice of seed cake and an attentive ear. "Bit warm for wool, isn't it, Miss Marple?" came the voice of Reverend Sampson, the young, broad-shouldered curate recently installed after the retirement of old Mr. Liddle. His grin was as wide as his collar was starched. "Oh, yes, quite," Miss Marple replied, eyes crinkling kindly. "But a pattern waits for no season." Just then, a peculiar hush fell over the fete. Not a silence exactly, but the murmur of voices altered. Curious, uncertain, and heads began to turn toward the old sunroom veranda of the manor house. It was a whitewashed annex with ivy up one side and an aging rocking chair set squarely in its center. The chair was old oak, darkly stained and worn to a soft polish on the armrests. It was rocking, back and forth, with no one in it. Oh, said Mrs. Abernathy, who had been sipping her sherry with a group of ladies from the church flower guild. She rose unsteadily. That's odd." Several people began walking toward it, the way one approaches something curious but slightly unsettling, a dog barking at a locked cellar door, or the wind slamming shut a window that had not been open. "There's no breeze," someone muttered. "Not even a whisper." The chair rocked once more, slower now, as if sighing, and then a scream, high, sharp, and slicing through the gathering like the edge of a broken teacup. It came from the far side of the sunroom, just behind the house. Within seconds, chaos unfolded. Mrs. Penelope Draycott, the village's head librarian and a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, stumbled into view, white as chalk, her gloved hands speckled with something dark, something red. "In the potting shed," she cried, eyes wild. He's dead, murdered." Someone shouted for the constable. Someone else fainted. Miss Marple did not rise. Not at first. She merely placed her knitting aside and pressed a palm to her lap, steady and thoughtful. She had not heard the scream before the chair began to rock. She noticed that. She noticed quite a lot, in fact. And so it was, in the sleepy village of Farnscombe Parva, beneath bunting and over the dregs of afternoon tea, that murder came quietly, like a breeze through an open window, or the motion of a chair that rocked with no one in it. The shock of the murder rippled through the fete like a drop in still water, distorting the calm and unraveling the genteel pleasantries. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Teacups were abandoned, jam pots left ajar. A quiet panic had taken hold, not loud or frantic, but tight-lipped and brittle, as if no one quite believed a thing so coarse as murder could happen in Farnscombe Parva, especially on such a pleasant day. Constable Rowntree arrived within 10 minutes, flustered, his cheeks already ruddy beneath his helmet. "Clear the way, if you please. Everyone stay back," he barked, though it was quite unnecessary. The villagers, hovering like cautious hens, had formed a respectful ring at least 20 feet from the potting shed. It was a small square structure behind the manor's sunroom, partly shaded by an old mulberry tree. Miss Marple, having excused herself politely from the doily table, walked slowly, almost absently, toward the rear of the crowd. She didn't press forward. There was no need. She preferred to observe from a slight remove, where voices carried and people forgot they were being heard. "It's awful," whispered Mrs. Lillian Banks, the postmistress, to no one in particular. "Simply awful. They say it was Mr. Geoffrey Hardcastle, bludgeoned, with a trowel no less." Geoffrey Hardcastle. Miss Marple recalled the name easily. A solicitor by trade, from London originally. He had moved to the village a little under a year ago, to enjoy a quieter life, as he had put it at the last parish council meeting. He was tall, courteous, and had a curious way of appearing quite candid while revealing very little. Miss Marple had always found that sort fascinating. "Bludgeoned, yes," murmured the vicar's wife, lips pale. "Penelope Draycott found him, said she was looking for a watering can and— oh, poor woman." Penelope, meanwhile, was sitting beneath a parasol, her gloves discarded, her breath still uneven. Someone had brought her a glass of sherry, which she held as though it might bite her. She stared ahead blankly, not touching it. "He was lying there," she kept repeating. "Just lying there, his head. Oh, there was so much blood. He shouldn't have been there. No one should have been there." Constable Rowntree emerged from the potting shed, his face pale now as well. "Keep everyone back," he muttered to one of the lads from the station, "and someone go fetch Inspector Cray from Much Widcombe. This is beyond our usual business." Miss Marple did not approach the constable. Instead, she watched the rocking chair, still and empty now, as though it had never moved at all. It sat motionless on the sunroom's wooden planks, basking in sunlight. She looked at the shed, then at the chair again. The villagers were buzzing in clusters now, whispering suspicions and weaving hasty theories from scraps of gossip. "Well, he was a bachelor, wasn't he?" said Mr. Timothy Hoyle, a retired schoolmaster with a voice that naturally dropped when things turned salacious. "Bit too well dressed for his own good. Some said he had debts in London, or perhaps a woman. London solicitors, you know. They get up to all sorts." "Or it could have been over that boundary dispute," offered Edna Price, who ran the bakery. Old Mr. Dunning claimed Hardcastle was sniffing around, trying to help Mrs. Abernathy reclaim that bit of path behind the churchyard. Dunning was furious. "Wouldn't be the first time land caused bloodshed," muttered Hoyle. Miss Marple, standing near enough to listen but far enough to remain inconspicuous, knitted another row and made no comment. She noticed something small. The chair's cushion, floral and slightly faded, had a faint indent, as though someone had sat there very recently, and yet no one claimed to have seen anyone near it before it began to rock. She turned to find Reverend Sampson hovering nearby, nervously adjusting his collar. "I never much liked the shed," he said mostly to himself. "Even as a boy, when Mother brought us here for the fates, always felt odd." "Odd?" Miss Marple echoed gently, not looking at him. "Oh, I don't know. Dark, damp, smelled of mildew and turpentine. I suppose all potting sheds do." "Not all, Reverend," she said kindly. "But perhaps it's not the smell we remember, but what we associate with it. Fear, for instance, can make a room seem darker than it is." He looked at her oddly, and then smiled a little, as though not quite sure whether she was serious. By the time Inspector Cray arrived, grim-faced and tall, with a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when annoyed, the villagers had been shooed indoors or sent home, save for a few stubborn onlookers and Mrs. Draycott, who was now being tended to inside the manor. Cray took Rowntree aside, and the two men spoke in low voices. Eventually, Cray turned and addressed the small cluster of lingering witnesses. "Anyone who saw Mr. Hardcastle today, or had any interaction with him, is to remain available for questioning. We'll be working out a timeline." Miss Marple, she looked up, surprised he addressed her so soon. "I understand you were seated quite near the veranda when the rocking chair was first noticed." "Yes," she said mildly, though I was not watching it. "It was brought to my attention by the sudden hush, by how everyone else reacted." I then saw the chair rocking. Yes. No one near it. No one at all, which is precisely what made it so unsettling. Craig grunted. Did you see Mr. Hardcastle during the fête? I did not, though I had heard from 2 separate sources that he was expected to attend. Odd that he never showed his face. Odd indeed, Cray muttered. As the formal questioning began and neighbors began whispering about gloves with blood and footprints in the soil, Miss Marple quietly took her leave. She walked slowly, hands folded around her reticule, through the village's narrow lanes. She was not heading home. Not yet. She had something else in mind. The local library, barely larger than a drawing room, was closed for the afternoon. But she had a key, as did a few other trusted villagers, and she let herself in. Once inside, she found what she was looking for quickly, a dusty, unused pamphlet on property lines and disputes in the county. It confirmed something she had only half remembered from a conversation at a garden luncheon last spring. Something about the Abernathy estate, the footpath, and a curious little triangle of land that, if one wasn't careful, could be lost to an adjacent property. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Land, secrets, and a solicitor. A tidy combination. She closed the pamphlet, returned it to the shelf, and turned to leave. Outside, the light had begun to shift. A shadow passed over the cobbled street as the church bell rang out the half-hour, and in the distance, faint but clear, the rocking chair creaked once more, as if someone had just left it, or had never quite gone away. The following morning brought a mist that clung to the hedgerows and softened the edges of the village like a whisper, blurring the familiar until it seemed almost unfamiliar. Miss Marple, early as always, was walking the well-worn path toward the manor house, her keen eyes taking in every detail, none too small to escape notice, as she well knew. The fête grounds were deserted, save for a few lingering signs of the previous day's revelry. A crumpled paper napkin caught in the hedge, a crushed petal or 2 scattered on the lawn. The rocking chair, now motionless, rested on the sunroom veranda as if resigned to its role as silent witness. No breeze stirred the leaves. The village was waking, but the day felt burdened beneath the weight of what had transpired. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was subdued. Mrs. Abernathy had retreated to her drawing room, flanked by her close friend, Miss Louisa Grant, who was gently insisting she eat something more substantial than sherry and scones. The servants moved quietly about, their faces drawn and pale. Miss Marple found herself once again in the company of Inspector Cray, who had spent the better part of the morning interviewing the remaining villagers and carefully cataloguing the evidence at the scene. He was not a man easily impressed, but she had already noticed the grudging respect he afforded her observations, despite his preference for facts and physical proof. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, tucking a folder under his arm. "I trust you slept well, though I doubt anyone else in Farnscombe Parva could say the same." She smiled gently. "Sleep comes easily when one is accustomed to the patterns of human nature, Inspector. And there are patterns in fear, just as there are in kindness." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Have you uncovered anything new?" she asked. Mr. Hardcastle's body was moved overnight, to the morgue in Much Widcombe. No one was allowed near it except the coroner. But we did find something near the potting shed, a small fragment of cloth caught on the thorn bush. Looks like it might be from the attacker's sleeve. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you find any footprints or signs of struggle beyond that?" "Very little. The soil around the shed is hard and dry, and no clear prints. No signs of forced entry either. Someone who knew the layout, perhaps, and certainly someone who wasn't expected." Her gaze drifted to the veranda and the silent rocking chair. "And the chair?" Cray shrugged. "We'll have the carpenter check for any mechanical faults or disturbances. But for now, it's just an oddity." "Oddities are often clues in disguise," she murmured. Later, as Cray departed to oversee further inquiries, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Penelope Draycott. The head librarian, still pale but composed, sat in the sunroom, clutching a handkerchief. Her eyes darted nervously whenever someone entered. "I understand you were the one who found Mr. Hardcastle," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes," Penelope replied, voice trembling. "I had gone to fetch the watering can. It was the only thing I could think of. I didn't want the flowers to wilt after yesterday's sun. Did you notice anything unusual before you saw him?" Penelope frowned, thinking. "Now that you mention it, there was a smell. Something sharp and strange, like paint or chemicals. I thought perhaps they'd been repainting the shed." "Did you see anyone nearby?" "No, but I thought I heard footsteps. A kind of scraping sound, like a chair moving on wood. But I was too far to be sure." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, Penelope. Sometimes what one doesn't see is as important as what one does." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll through the village, visiting several familiar faces with gentle questions, never too direct, but always enough to gather a thread or two. She stopped by the bakery, where Edna Price had prepared fresh rolls and seemed eager for distraction. "Did you hear anything last night, Edna?" Miss Marple inquired, while selecting a crusty loaf. "Not much," Edna replied, wiping flour from her hands. "But I did overhear the postmistress saying something about Mr. Dunning. Said he'd been unusually quiet since the news broke." "The landowner," Miss Marple mused. "Quietness can sometimes speak volumes." At the village green, she encountered Timothy Hoyle, who was fussing with the ribbons on his jacket. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I have been thinking, Miss Marple," he began conspiratorially, "that Geoffrey Hardcastle was more trouble than he let on. I heard from a source, I'll keep it discreet, that he was involved in some rather dubious dealings before he came here." "What kind of dealings?" Miss Marple asked, arching an eyebrow. Hoyle leaned in, lowering his voice. "Nothing concrete, mind you, but rumors of forged documents, bribery, even a scandal that ended a promising legal career." Miss Marple gave no immediate reply, but she filed the information carefully in her mind. Her last call was to Mrs. Lillian Banks at the post office, who was arranging letters behind the counter. The postmistress's usually warm demeanor was tinged with suspicion. "Mr. Hardcastle wrote to no one in the village," Mrs. Banks said bluntly. "No letters, no cards, nothing. That alone is odd, don't you think? A newcomer who keeps to himself is a man with secrets." Miss Marple agreed silently. Secrets had a way of rotting beneath the surface, until some unexpected force cracked the soil and exposed them. Returning to the manor as dusk fell, Miss Marple found herself once again drawn to the rocking chair. The veranda was deserted, the fading light casting long shadows. She ran her hand lightly over the polished wood, noting the subtle grooves and the faint scent of lavender, a curious fragrance given no one had mentioned it. Suddenly, footsteps approached. It was Miss Louisa Grant, who looked worried. "I fear the village is on edge," she said. Whispers and glances that once accompanied a smile are now laden with suspicion. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and suspicion, like a weed, spreads quickly if left unchecked." Louisa hesitated, then asked, "Do you truly think the rocking chair could mean something? That it could be a message, perhaps?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, a glimmer of her quiet sharpness shining through. "It might be. Sometimes objects are more telling than words." That night, after dinner, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reviewing the threads she had gathered. The solicitor with a murky past, the land dispute, the nervous villagers, the inexplicable rocking chair, and somewhere among it all, the truth waited, hidden behind appearances, buried in half-truths and long-held grudges. The chair creaked softly in the silence, as if inviting her to listen closer. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more observations. For now she allowed herself a moment's reflection, her eyes twinkling beneath the lamplight. Farnscombe was a village like any other, but beneath its placid surface, she knew a dangerous tide was rising, and Miss Marple was ready to meet it head-on. Morning arrived with a slender shaft of sunlight piercing the mist, softening the contours of Farnscombe as though the village itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple stepped out onto her porch with a cup of tea wrapped in a well-worn shawl. The day promised little comfort for anyone. The stillness bore down heavy, as though the air itself was charged with secrets too reluctant to be told. She decided to begin the day where suspicion seemed to hang thickest, the Abernathy estate. The manor house, with its ivy crawling up to the attic windows and slate roof, seemed to brood silently. Miss Marple moved carefully across the gravel path toward the sunroom veranda. The old rocking chair sat exactly as it had the night before. Empty, polished oak gleaming faintly in the morning light, its cushion showing the faintest indentations from yesterday's disturbed peace. The faintest creak echoed softly as the chair shifted imperceptibly, stirred by the slightest breath of wind. Or was it? Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. The chair's movement had unnerved many, but she knew that it was rarely the supernatural that explained such oddities. More often, it was a subtle human hand or a mechanical trick played by someone familiar with the house's creaks and sighs. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Cray, brisk and purposeful as ever, but with a hint of weariness in his posture. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his hat. "I'm afraid there's no shortage of questions today. I was hoping you might accompany me as I follow up with a few more villagers. Your insights have proven unexpectedly helpful." She nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I shall be pleased to assist, Inspector." Their first stop was the cottage of Mr. Charles Dunning, the local farmer who had come under suspicion due to the rumored boundary dispute with Mrs. Abernathy. The small house sat at the village's edge, its weathered stone walls and sagging roof marked by years of seasonal wear. Dunning was outside, repairing a fence post, his hands rough and soil-stained. His face was creased with both sun and worry. "Good morning, Mr. Dunning," Cray began. "I understand you had some disagreement recently with Mr. Hardcastle over the land adjoining your property." Dunning grunted. "Aye. It's not new, Constable. Been going on for months. Hardcastle wanted that strip for a footpath Mrs. Abernathy claims rights to, but I reckon it's mine. Comes down to old maps and faint memories." Miss Marple observed Dunning carefully. His eyes flickered to the edge of his property, where wild blackberry brambles had begun to claim a forgotten corner. "Did you see Geoffrey Hardcastle at the fete yesterday?" she asked softly. "No, can't say I did," Dunning replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Haven't seen much of him lately. Kept to himself mostly. Came to town for supplies sometimes, but mostly in and out." "And last night?" Cray pressed. "Did you hear or see anything unusual near the potting shed?" "No," Dunning said flatly. "Only the dogs barking at odd hours, but they're always yapping." Miss Marple caught a flicker of something beneath his gruff exterior, a hesitation perhaps, or a shadow of guilt. But nothing more. Their next visit was to Mrs. Edna Price's bakery, where the scent of fresh bread still clung to the air despite the early hour. Edna greeted them warmly, though a trace of anxiety lingered beneath her cheerful exterior. "Good morning, Inspector, Miss Marple," she said, pulling a flour-dusted apron tighter. "I heard the news about Mr. Hardcastle. Poor man, such a shock for our quiet village." Cray asked, "Mrs. Price, did you notice anything unusual yesterday? Any visitors? Strange conversations?" Edna paused, glancing out the window toward the village green. "Well, now you mention it, I did see Miss Penelope Draycott in a rather animated conversation with a stranger near the churchyard. I don't know who he was, but she looked quite unsettled afterward." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "A stranger, you say?" Indeed, Edna confirmed. Tall fellow, dark coat, spoke with a London accent. Not one of us. The inspector scribbled notes. Did anyone else see this man? I'll ask around, Edna promised. With a nod, Miss Marple and Cray moved on, their pace slower now as they ambled toward the village square. The townsfolk had begun to stir fully, and whispers clung to the corners like shadows. Miss Marple's eyes caught the figure of Mrs. Lillian Banks, the postmistress, busy behind the counter. She beckoned them in with a wary smile. Anything new, Lillian? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Banks hesitated, then lowered her voice. You know the post is always a hub for gossip, Miss Marple. But yesterday, before the fete, a letter arrived for Mr. Hardcastle. No return address, no postmark. Just a slip of paper inside with the words, "Meet me where the past lies buried." I didn't open it, of course. Felt like a threat. Curious, Cray said, looking thoughtful. And ominous, Miss Marple added softly. Do you still have the letter? Mrs. Banks reached beneath the counter and produced a small envelope, worn and yellowed. Miss Marple took it carefully, noting the neat handwriting. Thank you, Lillian, she said. This may prove important. Their next stop was the library, where Penelope Draycott awaited them. She was seated, composed now but still pale, and her eyes darted nervously. Miss Draycott, Cray began, we heard you spoke with a stranger near the churchyard. Can you tell us more? Penelope swallowed hard. Yes, it was just before the fete. He approached me, said he knew Geoffrey Hardcastle, that they shared history. I didn't recognize him. He asked about the property line and mentioned something about old family secrets buried with the Abernathys. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did he say his name? No, he vanished before I could ask. Cray frowned. A stranger with connections to the victim. Or someone who wanted to unsettle the village, Miss Marple mused. The afternoon wore on, bringing with it more questions and half-answers. Miss Marple found herself increasingly drawn to the small details, the faint scent of lavender in the sunroom that seemed out of place, the slight wear on the arm of the rocking chair that suggested frequent use, the way certain villagers avoided looking directly at her when she asked about Geoffrey Hardcastle. Back at the manor house, Miss Marple spoke privately with Mrs. Abernathy. The widow's demeanor was composed but guarded. Did Geoffrey Hardcastle have any close friends here? Miss Marple inquired gently. None, I'm afraid, Mrs. Abernathy replied. He was distant, polite, but kept to himself. I trusted him to manage some of the estate's affairs, but I hardly saw him. Did he mention any enemies? The widow hesitated. No, but there were whispers. Vague accusations of impropriety in his past, though no one would say so openly. I believed them to be nonsense. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes, the things people do not say speak louder than those they do. As evening descended, the village seemed to hold its breath once more. Miss Marple found herself alone on the veranda, the rocking chair still, the sunroom window reflecting the fading light. She fingered the small envelope from the post office in her pocket, the words, "Meet me where the past lies buried," lingering ominously. The past, she knew, was never truly buried in a place like Farnscombe Parva. It waited patiently, ready to rise when least expected, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover exactly what it was that the past wished to reveal. That evening, the village of Farnscombe Parva settled beneath a soft veil of twilight, the streets quieting as the day's uneasy energy ebbed into a restless calm. Yet inside the dimly lit parlor of the manor house, Miss Marple's mind was anything but at rest. She sat in a high-backed chair, the envelope still clutched lightly in her hand, the cryptic message echoing in her thoughts. "Meet me where the past lies buried." It was a phrase that invited curiosity, one that suggested a secret rooted in time and place, not just in words. Her fingers traced the edges of the envelope, worn and faintly creased, and her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where a faded photograph caught the glow of the firelight. It showed a younger Mrs. Abernathy, arm in arm with a man whose face was partly obscured by shadow, a man Miss Marple had not yet asked about. It was a reminder that the secrets of Farnscombe Parva ran deeper than anyone cared to admit. The next morning she rose early, as was her habit, and set out toward the churchyard, the probable location hinted at by the message. The churchyard was a place of quiet reverence and whispered memories, the gravestones worn by centuries of rain and sun. She wandered slowly among them, reading names and dates, noting family plots and inscriptions. Her sharp eye caught a curious detail, a recently disturbed patch of earth near the Abernathy family tomb, where the soil seemed softer and darker, as though freshly turned. Miss Marple approached the caretaker, a stooped man named Mr. Hall, who was trimming hedges nearby. "Good morning, Mr. Hall. Has there been any recent work near the Abernathy plot?" she inquired with gentle precision. He looked up, adjusting his cap. "Ah, Miss Marple. Yes, the groundskeeper had to move some stones and tidy the area last week. Lady Abernathy wanted to restore the family grave, but nothing unusual beyond that." She studied him for a moment. "Did you happen to see anyone else around the churchyard late at night or early morning in recent days?" Mr. Hall's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, I did spot a figure late one evening about a week ago. Tall, cloaked, moved quickly, didn't stop long either. Looked like they knew the place well." Miss Marple's mind ticked over the implications. A clandestine visitor to the churchyard. A secret meeting, perhaps, or a search for something lost. She thanked the caretaker and made her way back through the village, the cool air brisk against her cheeks. At the post office, she returned the envelope to Mrs. Banks, who was carefully sealing letters with practiced hands. "Did anyone else ask about that letter?" Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Banks shook her head. "No, just you, but I thought it odd that such a message would arrive for Mr. Hardcastle, who never seemed to trust anyone here." "Trust is a rare commodity in these parts," Miss Marple murmured. Next, she sought out Miss Penelope Draycott, whose nervous glances still betrayed her unease. Invited into the quiet library, Penelope confided in a low voice. "I'm frightened, Miss Marple. That stranger seemed to know so much, but said so little, and now Geoffrey is dead. I wonder if what he was hiding was something dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes steady. "Danger often wears the mask of silence, Penelope. But silence, too, can be broken." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. Inspector Cray stepped in, looking grave. "Miss Marple, we have news. The coroner's report confirms the cause of death as a blow to the back of the head, delivered with considerable force. There was no sign of a struggle, which suggests the victim was taken by surprise." Miss Marple absorbed the information, the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicking into place. "No struggle," she repeated softly, "which means the killer was someone Mr. Hardcastle knew or trusted enough not to resist." Cray nodded. "That narrows our suspects considerably." The inspector's words stirred the threads of village relationships in Miss Marple's mind. The solicitor who had brought Geoffrey here, the farmers with grievances, the villagers with old grudges, and the mysterious stranger who seemed to haunt the margins of this tragic tale. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the bakery again, hoping to learn more about the stranger. Edna Price was arranging freshly baked loaves when Miss Marple arrived. "I've heard more whispers about the man who spoke with Penelope," Edna said quietly. "Some say he might be related to the Abernathys, though none of us can be sure. The family has old secrets, you know. Things best left alone." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Secrets indeed, but they have a way of coming to light, especially when stirred by events such as these." Her next stop was the farmhouse of Timothy Hoyle. The young man appeared restless, fidgeting with a pocket watch that had long since stopped. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple," he said hurriedly. "About what you said before. About Mr. Hardcastle's past. I did some asking around. There was talk of a dispute over a will, something to do with his family back in London. Perhaps that stranger was connected to that." Miss Marple considered this. Disputes over inheritance can be as bitter as any feud, and they often motivate deeds one might never expect. As evening approached, she found herself back at the manor, where Mrs. Abernathy awaited with a somber expression. "I must ask, Lady Abernathy," Miss Marple began gently, "about the man in the photograph. Who was he to you?" The widow's eyes clouded briefly with emotion. "That was my late husband's brother, Arthur. He disappeared many years ago under mysterious circumstances. No one heard from him again. Some said he left for good. Others believed darker things." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Did Geoffrey ever mention him?" Mrs. Abernathy shook her head. "Never. But I have a feeling Geoffrey was searching for something or someone connected to that past." Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the envelope and its message. "The past lies buried," she whispered, "but perhaps not beneath earth alone." That night the rocking chair creaked faintly once more, as if stirred by unseen hands. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting her mind drift through the tangled web of relationships, motives, and secrets. Somewhere in the shadows of Farnscombe Parva, the truth waited patiently, ready to reveal itself, when the moment was right, and Miss Marple would be ready to listen. The following morning dawned grey and mist-laden, as if the very sky mourned the unsettling events that had begun to unravel the quiet fabric of Farnscombe Parva. Miss Marple wrapped herself in a thick shawl and set out once more, her mind alive with the fragments of conversation and the peculiar clues she had gathered. Her first visit was to the village pub, the Crown and Thistle, where gossip brewed thicker than the ale. The warm glow of the hearth inside offered a refuge from the chill, and the murmur of subdued voices hinted at unease rather than comfort. Miss Marple entered quietly, taking a seat near the window where she could observe without being observed. The villagers were still abuzz over Mr. Hardcastle's death, each eager to put forth their own theories and suspicions. Miss Marple listened patiently as Mrs. Edith Claremont, the village school teacher, fretted aloud about how tragedy could strike even in the most peaceful of places. "It must have been someone he knew," Edith said, wringing her hands nervously. "Why else would the killer come so close without a struggle? Geoffrey wasn't a man to be taken lightly." Across the room, Mr. Alfred Green, the local grocer, nodded in agreement. There was tension in the air at the fete yesterday. Geoffrey seemed distracted. I heard whispers of old grievances and family disputes, but who would have wanted to harm him? Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle exchanges, furtive glances, tightened jaws, the nervous clearing of throats. She knew the village well enough to read beneath the surface, to sense the underlying currents of fear and suspicion. As the afternoon unfolded, she made her way to the church once again, drawn by the enigmatic message in the letter and the freshly disturbed earth near the Abernathy tomb. The caretaker, Mr. Hall, was busy tending to the gravestones, and he greeted her with a tired smile. "Any word on that mysterious visitor you mentioned?" Miss Marple asked casually. Mr. Hall nodded slowly. "Yes, a man fitting that description was seen again last night, lurking near the churchyard gates just after dark. Didn't stay long, but it's clear he's been watching the place." The notion of a shadowy figure returning to the churchyard only deepened the mystery. Miss Marple pondered what might be hidden there. Family secrets, long-buried resentments, or perhaps a forgotten clue to Geoffrey Hardcastle's past. Later, she visited the Abernathy estate to speak with Mrs. Abernathy, hoping to glean more about the family history that might shed light on present troubles. The widow received her with a composed but distant air, as if still shielding herself from the shock of loss. "Mrs. Abernathy," Miss Marple began gently, You mentioned a brother-in-law who disappeared long ago. Do you believe his fate might be connected to Geoffrey's death?" Mrs. Abernathy hesitated, her fingers tightening around a handkerchief. It's difficult to say. Arthur was a complicated man. There were rumors of debts and dangerous associations. Geoffrey seemed determined to uncover something about him before he died. That evening, as Miss Marple returned home, she found a small package waiting for her. A parcel slipped discreetly through her letterbox. Inside was a worn, leather-bound diary, its cover cracked with age. No note accompanied it, but the handwriting inside was unmistakably familiar. Geoffrey Hardcastle's. With a careful hand, Miss Marple opened the diary and began to read. The entries painted a picture of a man burdened by secrets and haunted by a past that refused to stay buried. There were mentions of a lost inheritance, threats from unknown enemies, and a growing fear for his safety. One passage caught her eye. "The past will not rest until it is acknowledged. I must find the truth, even if it costs me everything." As the candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the room, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settle firmly upon her shoulders. The pieces were coming together, but the picture remained incomplete. She knew the next steps would require patience and subtlety, for in Farnscombe Parva, appearances were deceiving, and the deadliest truths often hid behind the most ordinary facades. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the diary resting open on her lap, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. Geoffrey Hardcastle's words resonated with an urgency that seemed to pulse beneath the quiet surface of the village. The phrase, "The past will not rest until it is acknowledged," echoed again in her mind. It was a key, a whisper from beyond the grave that hinted at layers of history and grievance that had lain dormant, waiting to be disturbed. The next morning, Miss Marple set off early, the diary carefully folded inside her bag. Her first call was to the village solicitor, Mr. Leonard Hawkes, a man known for his sharp mind and discreet manner. The solicitor's office was tucked away behind a row of shops, its windows thick with dust, as if untouched by time. Mr. Hawkes greeted her with a wary smile, his lined face betraying the wear of too many years tending to other people's affairs. "I understand you've come about Mr. Hardcastle," he said quietly, ushering her into a cramped office lined with shelves of legal tomes. "It's a delicate matter." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "I have reason to believe that his past, and possibly a dispute over inheritance, may have played a part in his death. I wonder if you could shed some light on the circumstances." Mr. Hawkes sighed, glancing at the door before settling into his chair. Geoffrey was always secretive, but yes, there was an ongoing dispute regarding the family estate in London. A contested will, if you will. It involved his late uncle, Arthur Abernathy, the very brother-in-law you mentioned to me the other day. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "What sort of dispute?" The will was complicated. Arthur had amassed some debts and questionable connections. The family feared scandal, and Geoffrey was determined to set things right. There were talks of legal maneuvers, but progress was slow. Geoffrey confided in no one but a trusted few. Did he ever mention threats, or any fear for his safety? Mr. Hawkes's expression darkened. There were vague hints. He said he received anonymous letters warning him to drop the matter. I was to handle it quietly, but the situation escalated faster than I anticipated. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the mysterious letter she had received. Could that have been one of the anonymous warnings, disguised beneath layers of civility? She thanked Mr. Hawkes and left with a renewed sense of direction. Her next visit was to the village postmistress, Mrs. Banks, who remembered the parcel she had delivered to Miss Marple. There was something peculiar about the letter, Mrs. Banks confided in a hushed tone. No postmark, no return address. It seemed meant for secrecy. Miss Marple nodded. Secrets indeed, and secrets that might cost a life. Walking back toward the village square, Miss Marple found herself pondering the people who had been closest to Geoffrey, the friends, acquaintances, and those who might benefit from his silence. She paused by the village green where a few children played and an elderly man sat feeding pigeons. The man's eyes, sharp despite his years, met hers with quiet interest. "Good morning, Mr. Finlay," Miss Marple greeted. "Ah, Miss Marple," he replied, smiling faintly. "Always a pleasure. You seem deep in thought." "There's more to Geoffrey Hardcastle's death than meets the eye," she said softly, "and the past is playing a larger role than we suspected." Mr. Finlay nodded slowly. "You know, I once knew Arthur Abernathy before he vanished. Rumor was he was mixed up with some unsavory characters, gamblers and worse. I wouldn't be surprised if those old ties have come back to haunt the family." Miss Marple considered this, filing away the information. It seemed the past was indeed a restless entity, stretching its fingers into the present. As the day waned, Miss Marple decided to revisit Penelope Draycott, hoping to learn more about Geoffrey's recent behavior. Penelope greeted her with nervous anticipation, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "I've been thinking about Geoffrey's secret meetings," she said. "He was meeting someone at odd hours, always cautious, always looking over his shoulder." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a quiet insight. "Did he ever say where?" Penelope hesitated. "Sometimes near the old mill on the edge of the village. He said it was a place where no one would watch." The old mill, a forgotten relic, creaking with the weight of neglect. Miss Marple resolved to visit it at first light. Later that evening, as she sat by the fire, she opened the diary once more. One passage stood out. "Trust is a fragile thing. One misstep and it shatters beyond repair. I fear I may have trusted the wrong person." The weight of those words pressed on her. Who had Geoffrey trusted? Who had betrayed him? The next morning, the mist still clung to the ground as Miss Marple approached the abandoned mill. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, dust. Motes danced in shafts of pale light filtering through broken windows. The air smelled of damp wood and forgotten memories. Miss Marple's eyes caught a scrap of paper pinned beneath a loose floorboard, a hastily scribbled note. "Meet me at midnight, alone. No one must know." Her pulse quickened. Someone was orchestrating meetings in the shadows, weaving threads of deceit. She tucked the note carefully into her pocket. As she turned to leave, a noise from above startled her, a faint shuffle, a creak of footsteps. She called out softly, "Is someone there?" No answer. She listened intently, but the mill fell silent once more. Outside, the village seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple knew the days ahead would unravel more than just a simple mystery. They would reveal the tangled web of trust and betrayal, where each thread led deeper into the heart of Farnscombe, Parva's darkest secrets. And through it all, Miss Marple remained patient, her eyes sharp, her mind alert. The past was stirring, and soon its shadows would be brought into the light. Miss Marple left the mill with a cautious sense of urgency. The whispered message pinned beneath the floorboard was a tangible thread in the tapestry of mystery that wrapped itself tighter around the village with each passing day. The invitation to meet at midnight, cloaked in secrecy, suggested not only the clandestine nature of Geoffrey Hardcastle's final days, but also a warning. Someone had been watching, waiting, or perhaps manipulating events from the shadows. She decided it would be prudent to visit the local constable, Inspector Bridger, to inquire if the police had any knowledge of unusual nighttime meetings or figures spotted near the mill. The inspector, a sturdy man of few words, greeted her with a mix of respect and mild impatience. His investigations thus far had focused on the more obvious suspects, and while he appreciated Miss Marple's insight, he remained inclined toward practical, concrete evidence rather than subtle, psychological nuances. "Inspector," she began gently, "have there been any reports of strange visitors or suspicious activity near the mill in recent weeks?" Inspector Bridger rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Nothing specific, Miss Marple, but I'll admit the mill's a spot where the local lads sometimes gather for mischief. I wouldn't be surprised if some vagrants or drunks passed through, but no one's reported anything outright threatening. Miss Marple nodded slowly, unwilling to dismiss the possibility that important details were simply overlooked amid the day-to-day routine. And the night of Mr. Hardcastle's death, any footprints, noises, anything out of place near the mill or surrounding woods? The inspector's brow furrowed. No footprints leading away, no signs of a struggle, and no witnesses who could place anyone there. It's as if the killer vanished into thin air. As she left the station, Miss Marple's mind drifted back to the people of the village, each with their own layers of secrets and motives. The mysterious note hinted at a meeting, but the question remained. With whom? Geoffrey's diary mentioned trusted confidants, but never named names. She thought of Penelope Draycott, whose nervous demeanour seemed to conceal a deeper knowledge. And then there was Richard Aberline, Geoffrey's distant cousin, who had surfaced only recently, ostensibly to settle family affairs, but whose sudden appearance felt oddly timed. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to see Penelope once again. She found her in the garden of the Draycott cottage, tending roses with trembling hands. The woman's eyes betrayed a blend of anxiety and determination, as if struggling against a secret too heavy to bear. Penelope, Miss Marple began softly, you mentioned Geoffrey's secret meetings. Was there anyone particular he was meeting? Someone you feared? Penelope hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. It's difficult to say. Geoffrey was always guarded, but I suspect he was trying to protect someone, or something. I overheard fragments of conversation, whispers about money, debts, and danger. I think he was in over his head. Miss Marple studied her closely. Did you notice if he seemed frightened? Penelope swallowed hard. Yes, more than ever before. He once told me that trust was fragile, but I never understood just how true that was until now. Encouraged by Penelope's candour, Miss Marple pressed further. Has anyone else shown unusual interest in Geoffrey's affairs? Anyone who might have felt threatened? Penelope glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. Richard Aberline. He arrived here last month, all charm and smiles. But something about him unsettled me. He asked too many questions, always probing as if searching for something. That name resonated sharply with Miss Marple's suspicions. Richard Aberline's sudden return to the village was an anomaly, an unexpected variable in the carefully balanced equation of village life. Before taking her leave, Penelope handed Miss Marple a small envelope. I found this in Geoffrey's room after everything happened. It's a receipt, or rather a note, from a moneylender. I don't know the full story, but it might be important. Miss Marple slipped the note into her bag, her mind already racing to piece together the puzzle. She promised Penelope she would do her best to find answers and left the garden with renewed purpose. The village was preparing for the annual fete once more, but the atmosphere was palpably different, tinged with apprehension and hushed whispers. Miss Marple wandered through the stalls and tents, observing familiar faces now shadowed by suspicion and grief. Her eyes landed on Richard Aberline standing near the tea tent, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. Approaching him calmly, Miss Marple greeted, "Mr. Aberline, moment of your time, if you please." He offered a polite smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Of course, Miss Marple. How may I assist you?" "I've been reviewing Geoffrey's affairs and the family disputes. I wonder, have you any knowledge of a moneylender connected to Geoffrey?" Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "Moneylender? I'm afraid I haven't heard of such a thing. Geoffrey managed his finances carefully, as far as I know." Miss Marple raised a delicate eyebrow. "Curious, because this note was found among his possessions." She pulled the receipt from her bag, laying it on the table between them. It mentions a loan taken shortly before his death. Richard's fingers twitched briefly, a subtle sign Miss Marple did not miss. I can assure you, Miss Marple, that any financial dealings Geoffrey had were above board. He was prudent, though sometimes secretive. Secretive enough to meet at midnight in an abandoned mill. Miss Marple probed gently. Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. People have their reasons for privacy. That doesn't mean wrongdoing. Miss Marple nodded slowly, letting the silence speak volumes. She made a mental note to inquire further into Richard Aberline's background, his motives, his past, and his ties to the village. That evening, she returned home to find a visitor waiting, a breathless Mrs. Edith Claremont, the school teacher, who looked as if she had rushed over straight from a storm. "Miss Marple," Edith exclaimed, "you must come at once. There's been an incident at the village hall. Someone has broken in." Together they hurried to the hall where a small crowd had gathered. The door was ajar, the lock shattered. Inside, the records room had been rifled through, papers scattered, drawers pulled open. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was a single, seemingly innocuous item left behind. A scrap of fabric caught on the broken lock, embroidered with a distinctive pattern. She bent to examine it closely. The delicate stitching was unmistakable. It belonged to the scarf Penelope Draycott always wore. A chill ran through Miss Marple. Was this a careless mistake, or a deliberate message? The villagers whispered among themselves, fear and accusation brewing anew. Miss Marple, however, felt a spark of clarity amid the confusion. The threads of this mystery were converging, the pattern becoming discernible, and soon the veil would be lifted. But patience was required, for every step closer to the truth revealed more shadows waiting to be explored. The chair that rocked with no one in it had set a chain of events into motion, events that would uncover the deepest secrets of Farnscombe Parva and test the limits of trust and betrayal alike. The discovery of the scarf fragment at the village hall sent a ripple of unease through Farnscombe Parva, as though the fabric itself had woven a thread connecting disparate parts of the puzzle that no one yet fully grasped. Miss Marple's sharp eyes traced the delicate embroidery, and immediately the image of Penelope Draycott's pale blue scarf, always worn just so, came to mind. Yet Miss Marple was certain that Penelope herself would never willingly leave such a clue behind. The question was whether it had been dropped by accident or planted with purpose. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Penelope's cottage. The roses in the garden, though blooming, seemed to droop under the weight of recent events. Penelope answered the door with a hesitant smile, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion and worry. "Miss Marple," she said softly, ushering her inside. "I heard about the break-in. It's unsettling, more so because nothing was taken." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied, settling into an armchair near the hearth. "The intruder wasn't after valuables. They were searching for something specific, perhaps records or correspondence. And yet the only thing left behind was this scrap of fabric. Tell me, Penelope, when was the last time you wore that scarf?" Penelope touched the scarf wrapped around her neck instinctively. "Yesterday morning at the fete preparations. I don't understand how a piece could have torn off without me noticing." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It suggests the intruder was careless or wanted to send a message." Penelope's gaze dropped. "Do you think someone is trying to frame me?" "It's a possibility we cannot ignore," Miss Marple said gently. "But more importantly, what might they fear, you know, or what might you be protecting?" Penelope hesitated, then took a deep breath. "There is something I haven't told you, something about Geoffrey's past and his relationship with my family." Miss Marple leaned in, her interest piqued. "Go on." Penelope's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "My father and Geoffrey were childhood friends. But when Geoffrey inherited the Abernathy estate, tensions arose. My father believed Geoffrey had wronged their family, and the two had a falling out. Geoffrey confided in me that there were secrets about the Abernathy fortune. Hidden documents that could change the understanding of the inheritance. He was trying to protect those documents, but he never said where. Miss Marple's mind connected the dots swiftly. The disputed will, the mysterious meetings, the break-in at the village hall, it all pointed towards someone desperate to unearth or conceal those papers. Penelope, I believe those documents might still be in this village, hidden where only Geoffrey could have kept them safe. Penelope's eyes widened. But where? Before Miss Marple could answer, there was a knock at the door. Both women turned, startled, to see Richard Aberline standing on the threshold, his expression guarded, but calm. "Miss Marple, Penelope," he said smoothly. "I hope I'm not intruding. I came to speak with you both about recent events and to offer my assistance." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. Richard's presence at this moment felt too convenient. "Mr. Aberline, what kind of assistance do you propose?" "I want to help clear the air," he replied. "The village is in turmoil, and I'm certain that resolving this matter swiftly is in everyone's best interest." Penelope shifted uneasily. "We were just discussing Geoffrey's secrets. Perhaps you know more than you admit." Richard smiled thinly. "I know Geoffrey was a complicated man. I also know that some people here have used this tragedy to stir suspicion and fear." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Penelope, then gestured for Richard to enter. "We could all benefit from clarity, Mr. Aberline." Once inside, Richard's composure faltered for a moment when Miss Marple produced the scrap of fabric. "I presume you recognize this." He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it belongs to Penelope, but that doesn't mean she's involved." "True," Miss Marple said. "But it does suggest someone wanted to implicate her, or send a warning." Richard's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "We must consider all angles." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the window. A village constable appeared, holding a small package. "Miss Marple, this was left for you at the post office. No sender's name." Taking the package carefully, Miss Marple opened it to find an old, leather-bound book, Geoffrey's grandfather's journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Inside were cryptic entries about family disputes, secret dealings, and references to a hidden truth buried within the estate. Penelope gasped. This must be it, the key Geoffrey was seeking. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Indeed, the past is revealing itself, one fragment at a time. The three of them pored over the journal by candlelight. The entries spoke of financial misdeeds, illicit partnerships, and a mysterious codex, a ledger said to contain evidence that could alter the inheritance and expose those who profited from deception. Richard's face grew pale. If this codex exists, it could ruin many reputations. Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. And perhaps that is why Geoffrey was silenced. The night deepened as they planned their next steps. Miss Marple resolved to search the Abernathy estate itself, beginning with the old library, where Geoffrey had spent many hours researching. As she prepared to leave, Penelope took her hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I feel we're closer to the truth than ever." Miss Marple smiled gently. "The truth often hides in plain sight, dear. One must simply know where and how to look." Outside, the village lay cloaked in darkness, the air thick with anticipation. Somewhere, within the walls of the Abernathy estate, the chair that had rocked with no one in it awaited the return of its secrets, ready to unveil the final act in a drama written by deceit, fear, and betrayal. Miss Marple stepped into the night, her senses alert. The game was far from over. Miss Marple approached the Abernathy estate under the faint glow of a waning moon, the silence around her thick with the weight of anticipation. The manor, with its ivy-clad walls and towering chimneys, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that long-buried secrets were about to surface. Her footsteps on the gravel path were soft, but each one echoed in the stillness, mingling with the distant hoot of an owl. The front door was unlocked. An oversight or an invitation? She paused, fingers poised on the handle, before stepping inside. The interior smelled of old wood and forgotten memories, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the grand entrance hall. Miss Marple's eyes quickly adjusted, and she moved with the quiet confidence born of years spent reading human nature and its many guises. Her first destination was the library, a room Geoffrey had often described to her in past conversations. It was lined floor to ceiling with dusty tomes, leather-bound volumes, and the occasional curious trinket. The heavy curtains were drawn, muffling the moonlight, but a thin sliver seeped beneath the edges. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the grand oak desk near the window, its surface cluttered with papers and an overturned inkpot. She carefully examined the scattered documents, her fingers tracing the lines of handwritten notes and sketches. Some of architectural plans, others cryptic jottings about inheritance rights and disputed lands. But the desk itself held a secret. The bottom right corner of the top drawer was slightly misaligned. With deft hands, she pulled it open and discovered a false bottom concealing a small compartment. Inside lay a thick bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon, old letters, and, beneath them, a leather-bound ledger, worn and fragile. The Codex. Miss Marple handled it gingerly, aware that these pages might be the key to unlocking the tangled web surrounding Geoffrey's death. She flipped through the ledger, noting entries in a meticulous hand, names, dates, and sums of money exchanged discreetly, implicating several prominent village families in dubious financial dealings spanning decades. Her mind immediately returned to the recent revelations: the moneylender's note, Richard Aberline's sudden arrival, Penelope's family grudge, and the strange break-in at the village hall. All threads converged here, entwined in a story of greed, betrayal, and fear. Suddenly, a faint noise from the hallway alerted her. Miss Marple quickly closed the drawer and slipped the Codex into her bag. She moved toward the door, her eyes narrowing as a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A figure stepped forward, blocking her path. "Miss Marple," came the voice, low and edged with surprise. "I didn't expect you here at this hour." It was Richard Aberline. She studied him carefully. His usual charm seemed strained, his expression tight. "Mr. Aberline, it appears we both have secrets to uncover." He gave a bitter smile. "I came to stop you from digging any deeper. This Codex, these documents, they'll destroy more than reputations. They'll ruin lives. Some things are better left buried." Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "Justice is seldom served by silence, Mr. Aberline. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." His gaze flickered. "I fear for this village, Miss Marple. The truth could shatter its fragile peace." "Perhaps," she agreed softly, "but peace built on lies is a fragile peace indeed." Before Richard could respond, footsteps sounded from the grand staircase. Both turned to see Penelope Draycott descending, her face pale but determined. "Richard," she said firmly, "what are you doing here? You promised you'd keep your distance." Richard's jaw clenched. "Penelope, this isn't the time for theatrics." Miss Marple stepped forward, bridging the tension. "Clearly, there are many truths we need to face together." Penelope nodded, then turned to Miss Marple. "I want to help. Whatever secrets this Codex holds, the village deserves to know." Richard's eyes darkened. "And what of the damage it will cause? People will lose everything." Miss Marple's voice was calm but resolute. "The truth has a way of emerging, one way or another. Better to confront it openly than let it poison the community in silence." The three stood in uneasy alliance as Miss Marple suggested they examine the ledger together to understand fully who was implicated and what the ramifications might be. They spread the Codex on the desk, candlelight flickering across the pages, illuminating the fine script and revealing names both familiar and surprising. Among the entries, Miss Marple noted payments made to a local moneylender, interest rates exorbitant, and debts spiraling beyond control. Geoffrey's name appeared frequently, alongside those of influential villagers, including some who had vocally condemned him. As the hours slipped by, the atmosphere thickened with tension and revelation. Penelope's voice trembled as she read aloud a letter tucked among the papers, penned by Geoffrey's grandfather, warning of a pact made in desperation, a secret deal that had bound the family to a fate of ruin unless the truth could be uncovered. Richard's composure broke. This changes everything. I never knew. Miss Marple looked between them. And now? You do. The question remains, who would go to such lengths to keep these secrets hidden? Who benefits most from Geoffrey's silence? Suddenly, a sharp noise echoed from the drawing room, a window shattering. The trio exchanged startled glances before rushing toward the sound. There, silhouetted against the broken glass, stood a figure cloaked in shadows. A struggle ensued briefly, but the intruder fled into the night, leaving behind a small, worn photograph, a faded image of Geoffrey Hardcastle, a younger man smiling beside another figure whose face was obscured. Miss Marple picked up the photograph, her heart pounding. This was no random break-in. The person who attacked them wanted to send a message, to intimidate, or perhaps to retrieve something. Back in the library, she laid the photo alongside the codex and the other documents. "The final pieces are falling into place," she murmured. "But there is still one question unanswered. Why the rocking chair?" Penelope looked up, eyes wide. "The chair in Geoffrey's study, the one that moved on its own." Miss Marple nodded. "A symbol, perhaps, or a warning. Someone wanted us to notice it, to realize that Geoffrey's death was no accident." Richard swallowed hard. "Then it's clear that the killer is still among us." The weight of that realization settled heavily over them all. Outside, the village continued its restless slumber, unaware that the delicate balance between peace and chaos had been shattered. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently. "Tomorrow, we confront the past and the present. Until then, we watch, we wait, and we listen. The truth will come, but only when those who hide it have nowhere left to run." As dawn's first light filtered through the curtains, the three remained in the quiet room, bound by the fragile alliance of seekers in a village shadowed by secrets and danger. The final act was near, and Miss Marple's mind raced with the certainty that the chair that rocked with no one in it was the silent witness to a story that only she could unravel. Morning light crept softly through the heavy drapes of the Abernathy Estate Library, casting a muted glow over the scattered papers and the small photograph that lay beside the codex. Miss Marple sat quietly in the high-backed chair, her fingers lightly tracing the worn edges of the ledger. The room felt heavier now, laden with the weight of half-revealed truths and unspoken fears. Across from her, Penelope and Richard sat tensely, each lost in their own thoughts, the fragile alliance forged the night before still tentative and uneasy. Outside, the village stirred to life, unaware that beneath its quaint veneer, the shadows of long-buried secrets were drawing ever closer to the surface. Miss Marple's gaze rested momentarily on the photograph, a faded image of Geoffrey Hardcastle standing beside a man whose face had been deliberately obscured. There was something deliberate in the photograph's damage, a hint of malice that chilled her more than the night air ever could. This was a warning, or perhaps a challenge. Penelope broke the silence, her voice soft but resolute. "Miss Marple, if the killer wanted us to find this photograph, then what is it they hoped we'd see?" "The identity of the man beside Geoffrey," Miss Marple replied. Or rather, the absence of that identity. Someone wanted to erase him from memory, yet couldn't quite destroy the evidence. Richard frowned. A man erased from a photograph, but still connected to Geoffrey. Could it be someone from the village, or an outsider? "Sometimes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. The most dangerous people are those we least expect, those who hide behind the mask of familiarity. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, summoned earlier by a concerned neighbor who had spotted strange activity near the estate's grounds before dawn. "I thought it prudent to check on you all," the inspector said, stepping inside with a measured air. His eyes swept the room, taking in the tense expressions and the evidence spread before them. "I trust no further trouble occurred overnight?" Miss Marple nodded. "An intruder attempted to enter the drawing room. We were fortunate they fled before causing harm, but they left behind this photograph." She held it up carefully. "It may be a key piece of the puzzle." Inspector Craddock examined the image closely. Fascinating. Whoever this man was, someone wanted to ensure his identity remained a secret. The inspector's presence brought a measure of reassurance, but Miss Marple could see the wheels turning behind his steady gaze. The police were eager for resolution, yet she sensed their impatience to close the case too quickly. The truth, she knew, was far more intricate. After the inspector left to organize a search of the grounds, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the codex. She had spent hours cross-referencing names and dates, uncovering a tangled web of debts, favors, and betrayals that implicated not just Geoffrey's immediate circle, but many respected villagers. Among them was one name that caught her eye: Edward Pritchard, the village solicitor and trusted advisor to the Abernathy estate. "Penelope, Richard," she began quietly. "We must speak with Mr. Pritchard. His role in these transactions is more significant than he has let on." The suggestion was met with apprehension, but both agreed. The solicitor's office was a short walk from the estate, nestled between the bakery and the post office, its dark wood-paneled windows gleaming in the morning sun. Edward Pritchard greeted them with the practiced politeness of a man accustomed to authority. Yet there was a tightness around his mouth and a flicker of wariness in his eyes that did not escape Miss Marple. "I hear you have questions," Pritchard said smoothly as they settled into his cramped office. "I assure you, I have done nothing but my duty to the estate." "Your duty, yes," Miss Marple said, "but your ledger entries suggest otherwise. Large sums unaccounted for, secretive dealings. Can you explain these?" Pritchard's facade cracked for a moment before he composed himself. "The estate's finances are complex. There have been debts to settle, investments to protect. I've always acted in the estate's best interest." "And yet," Miss Marple pressed gently, "some of these entries coincide with payments to the moneylender and with rumors of blackmail circulating the village." Pritchard's eyes darkened. "Rumors are a dangerous thing. They can ruin reputations without a shred of truth." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "but the truth has a way of revealing itself, even from the smallest thread." Her words seemed to unsettle him. The solicitor shifted uneasily. "Is there something you suspect?" "I am merely gathering facts," Miss Marple said, watching him closely. "But I wonder, what do you know of Geoffrey's attempts to protect the codex? Did you ever discuss its contents with him?" Pritchard's expression tightened. Mr. Hardcastle was a difficult man, obsessed with secrets and past grievances. He confided little, except that some truths were too dangerous to expose. "And yet," Miss Marple added softly, "he entrusted you to safeguard his affairs." Pritchard's composure faltered again, and he looked away. "There are things I cannot speak of, for the good of the village." Before the conversation could continue, a sharp rap came at the door, and a young clerk entered with a telegram. Pritchard accepted it with a brief glance, then opened it, his face paling as he read. "It appears," he said in a strained voice, "that the financial institution managing the Abernathy estate's investments has suspended all activity pending an inquiry. This could ruin us all." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Then the stakes are higher than we thought." Leaving Pritchard's office, the trio returned to the village square, where whispers and furtive glances followed their every move. The tension was palpable, The secrets that had once simmered beneath polite smiles were now surfacing, exposing fractures in friendships and alliances. As they walked toward the village inn, Penelope confided, "My mother warned me once that the Abernathy legacy was cursed, that those who sought to unearth the past only invited trouble." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Curses, my dear, are often man-made, born of greed, fear, and the desire to protect one's reputation at any cost." At the inn, they found the usual gathering of villagers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the subtle exchanges between familiar figures, the whispered conversations, the sidelong glances, the quick silences as she passed. Among them was Margaret Pritchard, Edward's wife, who greeted Penelope with a forced warmth. Yet her eyes betrayed something more, a secret withheld, a story left untold. Miss Marple approached her quietly. "Margaret, sometimes the heaviest burdens are those we carry in silence. If there is anything you wish to share, I am here to listen." Margaret's composure wavered, and after a moment she whispered, "I've long feared what my husband is involved in, but I dared not speak for the sake of our family." Miss Marple's gaze was kind. "Sometimes courage comes in the quietest moments. You need not face this alone." As evening descended, Miss Marple returned to the Abernathy estate, her mind a whirl of revelations and unanswered questions. The photograph, the codex, the shadowy intruder, the solicitor's evasions, all pieces of a complex mosaic that only she could assemble. In Geoffrey's study, the infamous rocking chair sat still, its presence both haunting and symbolic. Miss Marple traced her fingers along the carved wood, feeling the invisible tremor of unrest that still lingered. The final act was close. Soon the truth would emerge, unmasking the killer hidden among the familiar faces of Farnscombe Parva. But until then, the village held its breath, caught between the comfort of secrets and the inevitable reckoning. And Miss Marple, ever patient and perceptive, prepared to play the last move in a game of shadows, where every glance and every whisper carried the weight of a deadly truth. The evening air in Farnscombe Parva was thick with anticipation as the village gathered once more in the drawing-room of the Abernathy estate. Candles flickered softly, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits upon the wall-papered walls. Miss Marple sat quietly, her fingers clasped calmly, eyes observing each face with gentle, unwavering attention. The tension was palpable, not merely from the recent upheaval, but from the unspoken knowledge that the night's gathering would change everything. Richard and Penelope stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of hope and apprehension. The villagers, now fully aware of the gravity of recent events, exchanged furtive glances and whispered speculations. Among them were Edward and Margaret Pritchard, their composure fragile under the weight of suspicion. Inspector Craddock remained by the door, ready to act but deferential to Miss Marple's lead. Miss Marple finally broke the silence with her soft, measured voice. "Thank you all for coming. The past few days have unsettled our peaceful village, and it is time the truth be brought into the light." She glanced toward the solicitor, then toward the others who had played their parts unwittingly or otherwise. The murder of Geoffrey Hardcastle was not a crime of passion nor a random act. It was a carefully planned act born out of desperation and fear. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "Many of you know that Geoffrey was in possession of the Codex, a ledger revealing long-hidden debts and betrayals within our community. It was a document that threatened reputations and legacies alike." Miss Marple turned her gaze to Edward Pritchard. "Mr. Pritchard, you have served this village as a solicitor with great care. Yet your ledger entries reveal a different story, one of secret payments and concealed dealings. You feared exposure, did you not?" Edward's face paled, but he remained silent, eyes cast downward. "More than that," Miss Marple pressed gently. You were desperate to protect the estates and your own interests. When Geoffrey threatened to reveal the codex's contents to the authorities and to the villagers, you decided to silence him. A murmur rippled through the room, but Miss Marple raised a hand for quiet. The night of the garden party, you took advantage of the gathering's chaos. You approached Geoffrey in the drawing room, where the rocking chair now stands empty, yet still rocking. In the struggle that followed, you struck him down and staged the scene to suggest an accident. Edward's composure broke. It was never meant to go this far. Geoffrey was ruining us all with his threats. But, Miss Marple said, the Codex also reveals another crucial piece, a mysterious figure from Geoffrey's past who might have provided leverage. The torn photograph we found was your attempt to erase that connection, to prevent anyone from digging too deeply. Edward's shoulders sagged. I was trapped. The debts, the lies. I thought I was protecting the village, the estate, our future. But the truth, Miss Marple said softly, is that no secret is safe in a village where everyone watches and listens. It is the smallest details, the rocking chair that moved with no one in it, the overlooked photograph, the frightened glances, that tell the story. Inspector Craddock stepped forward and took Edward into custody, his expression grave but relieved that justice would now be served. As the villagers began to process the revelation, Penelope reached Miss Marple's side. Thank you, Miss Marple. Without you, we might never have uncovered the truth. Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes, the quietest voices hold the loudest truths. It is in the understanding of human nature, in the patterns of fear, hope, and deception, that the mystery unfolds. That night, as the village settled back into uneasy calm, Miss Marple sat once more beside the still rocking chair. The shadows had lifted, but the lessons remained clear. Beneath the serene surface of any community lies a web of secrets, waiting patiently for a discerning eye to untangle. And Miss Marple, with her subtle wit and endless patience, was always ready to listen.